Coming up on this edition of Safari Changemakers.
It was remarkable. We ended up just being able to create some of the most magnificent partnerships with local communities and to create these conservancies. And in fact, all of them are still going on today. I think something like 35% of Namibia is now set aside for community conservancies along the exact same lines of what we pioneered in those early days by accident.
This is Safari Changemakers. Conversations with Africa's most innovative visionaries, the guardians, pioneers, and trailblazers, offering solutions to the most pressing challenges facing the continent. Over-tourism, human-wildlife conflict, the climate crisis, and environmental degradation. Conversations that reveal bold strategies for sustainable tourism leading to economic opportunities for indigenous communities while protecting local ecosystems and wildlife. Here's your host, founder of Artisans of Safari, recognized by Travel and Leisure and Condé Nast Traveler magazines as one of the top travel specialists for Africa, Karin Jones.
Today is part one of our discussion with a true safari pioneer who dates from the early days of the industry and gives an historical perspective on regenerative tourism in Africa, as well as an inspiring blueprint for the future. An esteemed author, legendary guide, and co-founder of Wilderness Safaris and Natural Selection, Colin Bell. So I'm here today with Colin Bell, who is someone in the safari industry that we all know. And for anyone that doesn't know him, legend has it that you flipped a coin in 1970 and you chose between a career as a finance person or a safari guide.
Sure. Well, not quite 1970. 1976 was a pivotal year in South Africa. Okay. So I went to university in Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and I ended up on my first day, and I was in Accounts 101, and I realized, this is tricky. And my second lecture was Law 101, and I thought, wow, this is terrible. And but I'd started and I'd enrolled, and once you get going, you got to keep going. And I ended up then, to make my economics degree a lot more interesting, I ended up doing a whole lot of courses in geology and geography and all those kind of things, which really made me excited. You know, as a kid, I was brought up in South Africa, but very close to the Botswana border, up in the Kalahari. And as a kid, that was home. We used to sort of run out the back door when we were in the veld. And we used to run around bare feet and just do what little kids do. And that was kind of the life I was used to. But suddenly to go and think about Economics 101 or Accounts 101 was just awful. So I ended up with this degree with a whole lot of geology mainly. And so when I came to my last year, which is 1976, in fact, 16th of June, yesterday, was a pivotal year in South African history when the kids in the black townships just revolted against the apartheid system, against the education system, and South Africa was in flames. And it was an uncomfortable place. And I made the decision then and there that I wasn't going to work in South Africa. So did my degree and all the rest of it and finished, and then decided, what do I do? And I was offered two jobs. One was as a geologist, kind of working in what was then Southwest Africa, Namibia today. And the other one was a safari guide. And the geology job was a huge amount of cash relative from what I was used to, which was nothing. And but you know, being out in the middle of nowhere and just being literally on your own and doing lots of sort of kind of grid work and stuff like that. On the other side, the safari industry paid nothing but promised lots of fun. And I didn't know what, cash or fun. You know, you got to think about your career and what to do. And I literally, and both of these companies had their head office in Main Street, Johannesburg. 44 Main Street was the mining center of mining in Southern Africa, and this little safari company on the other end of Main Street had this little pokey office. And I literally spun a coin and it said, right, Botswana. So I found myself suddenly running safaris in Botswana and never actually been there. I mean, those days were incredible. Wow. So my first year of safaris was 1977 in Botswana, where it took 3 days to drive from Johannesburg through to Maun. It was, I mean, that trip just to get to Maun was extraordinary. I mean, Maun at that stage had about 1 kilometer of tarred road. It was this tiny little dusty donkey den. It's quite big now today. It's got 80,000 people. But in those days, it was this little tiny little place, the frontier town. Yeah. And that was it. So that was how safari started. We had these old Series 3 Land Rovers where you had a trailer and you packed up everything for 2-3 weeks and no fridges. Everything was tinned or whatever. And off you went. I mean, literally a cold beer was, 2 socks on your on your wing mirrors, and you drip down a bit of water, and it'll cool the beers down a fraction. Not cold, not by anything, but that was the luxury of the day. And Botswana was nothing. It was a huge hunting industry, but photographics was just almost zero. There were a couple of early pioneers. One guy, PJ Bestelig. I mean, PJ's just had his 50th year of running safaris continuously, 50 years solidly. So PJ was there and a few other hardy souls, but almost nobody else. It was just this kind of frontier town, a couple of tiny little reed huts here and there, which you can go and book. And it was mainly mobiles. And we were so fortunate to be part of Botswana in those early days.
Interestingly, my first experience in Africa was in '89, so it was quite a few years later, but it was in Botswana as well. I remember landing at that little Maun airport, and of course, no security. It was about the size of someone's living room. You walked across the street to the Duck Inn. And
there we go. The
was that there?
Inn. My goodness, yeah.
Yeah, and there was on the wall were all the scores of everybody's dart tournaments, and it was so different. Everything was just sandbars to get through the town.
Well, we had a house up in about 5 km north of Maun, and literally in between safaris, we could put a brick, and these turnarounds were incredibly tight. You'd finish one safari and then you have a day or so to fix up your Land Rover and go again. And we could put a brick on our accelerator. You'd go onto these big, deep, sandy ruts.
Yeah.
And you put your brick there, and the vehicle would be heading down these sandy ruts all the way into town while you were cleaning out the back and all that type of stuff. That's the way it was. It was frontier countryside, and it was pioneering times and wonderful times. They were really fun and all the rest of it. And to see how the industry has evolved from those early days, and in particular to see how Botswana's evolved. And people often say to me, isn't it so sad to see how Botswana's really come alive? So it got crowded. Hardly crowded. Yes, there's been a few areas which have been sacrificed, but Botswana's wildlife today is in many respects actually better than it was in those days, because in those days we had an extraordinary amount of poaching which was going on throughout Africa. I think the rhino population in, what was the official numbers? In 78, there was something like 65,000 rhinos in Africa, and by 87, there was something like 4,000. And elephants, if you saw an elephant in 77, or a group of females in particular, and they were there, you went that way. You would literally go the other way because the poaching was so rife.
Oh, wow.
The ivory syndicates were just off the charts. East Africa was being poached to smithereens, and because they had the majority of the big tuskers, that's where a huge amount of the original poaching was going on, until we hit sanity in 1989-90. When the world got together and they put ivory and elephants onto Appendix 1 and CITES. And that was a pivotal moment, because from then onwards, all trade was illegal. And that was kind of led by the Kenyans. Leakey and President Moi went around the States and did all their lectures at that time when you were first arriving in Botswana.
Yeah.
And, the main consumer of ivory at that time was the American market. And they managed to persuade first of all, the American public. They went onto all the trade shows and your TV shows, and they went into the halls of power and persuaded the authorities to change the listing of elephants into Appendix 1. And from that moment, when all trade was illegal and they'd bust the perception, I mean, every single person used to walk around with elephant bangles and ivory around the necklaces and all the rest of it. It was cool in those days.
Yeah.
But they managed to turn around, Leakey and Moy, and get the elephants onto Appendix 1, and that was remarkable. From that day onwards, it wasn't sexy to have elephants around people and bracelets and stuff like that. And then the same with rhinos. They did the same in rhinos in 93. And from those days onwards, things changed. It was a remarkable as day and night. And slowly elephants started to relax. There wasn't the same amount of poaching going on. And today, it's quite extraordinary. You've got elephants around your camps at night. I remember one time in the 70s, we absolutely pooped ourselves because a herd of elephants walked through the camp.
Yeah.
Just by pure fluke, one of those rare occasions, because they were so scared of humans. They used to just chase you and harass you. And we all had to go and shelter inside a Land Rover. Now, I don't know what an aluminium-made Land Rover is going to do to protect a bunch of elephants who are going to smash you. But that's the way it was. Now you're in Africa, you can sit and you can watch elephants with incredibly close proximity, and you can just quietly just watch them going about their business and part of it. And so these massive changes in elephant behavior, as we've got far away from the hunting eras, away from the poaching eras and all that type of stuff, it's been quite a remarkable change to witness over time.
So who were those early clients? Were they those photographic safari clients in those days? Where were they coming from?
It was a mixed bag. So one of our biggest breaks, so in 77, it was kind of hardy. I mean, a safari to Botswana would cost about, in dollars then, it was about $150, $200. But it was hard camping.
Yeah.
I mean, literally the hardest camping. And it was people who were really hardy, coming through very, very little international traffic. A lot of people living in Southern Africa were our first sort of customers. When we started in 83, with my first company, which is Wilderness Safaris, we started that in 83. We managed to get into Mountain Travel's catalog. And Mountain Travel at that stage was the preeminent, the most kind of highly sought after organization. If you can make it to Mountain Travel, you made it. And there was a guy called Leo Le Bon, and he was one of these early pioneers, and Dick McGowan and these kind of characters who really Dick was a proper mountaineer. These guys used to go up McKinley and all these things, Everest and stuff like that. And we got into their catalog. So that was one of our first lucky breaks. But then also a lot of the people living in South and Southern Africa. I mean, we put on a bird watching safari including flights from Johannesburg, and we had notoriously so unreliable, the airlines at that stage. But we could put a week on safaris with well-known bird watcher like an author like Ken Newman or something like that for about a couple of $100. And we put it out there, and we had no sooner we put it out, we had a waiting list of about 50. So we knew we were onto a good thing. So the bird watching kind of fraternity locally, people living in Southern Africa who wanted to go and see the wonderful bird life of the Okavango, that was kind of one of our first breaks. And I partnered with this extraordinary guy called Chris McIntyre. Him and I started Wilderness Safaris way back in 83. And I still rate today, he must be the finest guide who's ever been in Africa. I mean, he's just was one of the funniest, one of the most caring, one of the most knowledgeable guys. And he came out of New Zealand as a 17-year-old. And he just found New Zealand so boring and went to Australia and hated it. And the only place which would take him was Rhodesia in those days. So Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in the 80s. But in the 70s, he popped over there. And the only place which would take him, which he had to lie about his age, was in the parks. And they put him up in the Zambezi Valley, which today is one of the most fantastic wildlife areas anywhere. But in those days, it was a war zone. And Chris, yeah, is coming out of peaceful New Zealand and finding himself in a bloody war zone with bombs going off and all sorts of nonsense. And then he had a year of that. But in that year, he learned every single tree, bird, the Latin names, and he became this extraordinary naturalist. And after a year of
self-taught,
dodging bombs, he pitched up in Botswana, and we became good mates. And then we started Wilderness together. And to have him as our lead guide was amazing. He just was extraordinary. He could take. I mean, we had a whole lot of your TV personalities come on safaris with us, and they would just become instant friends. And you could take an 80-year-old, an 18-year-old, and an 18-month and just give them all the best time of their life. And I kind of put it in on his coattails, and I learned a lot from him. And we just kind of just made it happen. And we had to busk it. But we were also fortunate that we managed to get the first fridge in a mobile safari. I mean, can you imagine having a little fridge?
Yeah.
And your mood every
better
day.
Than a sock.
Yeah. Much better than the socks. At least there was a chance you get a mildly cool beer in the evening. But your mood was dependent on you woke up in the early morning, getting the fires ready. And if you didn't have a puncture and your fridge was cold, amazing. The day was going to be great.
Yeah.
But those fridges were temperamental. And quite often you get they function with this kind of gas. And if you got a bubble in the wrong place, you had to try and free up the bubble. And the only way you could really do it was to actually take everything out, turn it upside down, drive it around and bump it around, and then it would free up the bubble. And one of our very first employees, a guy called Joseph Sekwa, an amazing guy who pitched up. He needed a job. He ended up being a director of wilderness safaris, way down the line. And Joseph picked up, and his first job was to take this fridge out and then put it in the back of a bakkie. We had a little pickup. And then he had to drive around town holding this fridge and then put it back in when we had 2 hours later. And he came, this is his first job he's ever had in his life. And he said, these crazy Mulungus, they make me take this fridge out, and it's tricky because all the screws are in the wrong places and you've got to get your fingers graunched to get all the things out. And he's got to carry it and bounce it around and then put it back in again. He couldn't. So these kind of things, we got this reputation for being this crazy crowd in Maun.
Yeah.
But anyway, we made it happen, and I say Joseph literally became a director of wilderness safaris from nothing, absolutely nothing. This wonderful progression, and to see those kind of changes over the times was very, very satisfying.
And wilderness went from Botswana to other countries, and then also to safari camps as well.
That's right. So it was so we had these guests who came 2-3 times, and then they say, what's next? So we contacted, so by then Rhodesia was gone and it was now Zimbabwe. And so some of the best guides we'd ever come across. A lot of our safaris were started in Maun and finished Vic Falls or vice versa. So we met some wonderful people in Vic Falls, Brian Worsley and these kind of characters. And we started a company in Zimbabwe, and then we started a company in Namibia, and just to cater for the overflow along the same lines, highly personalized, mobiles mainly. And then slowly we needed our own bases and all the rest of it. And then the kind of, to have a base where you could sort of know that you could be part of a mobile and bring people through, this sort of the need for kind of, I'd hate to call them lodges. I mean, these things were so rudimentary.
Yeah.
When you think, you must see some of the early photographs of these lodges, and we were so proud of them. These were our luxury lodges. Oh my goodness, today. We couldn't put a staff member in them today. We'd be had up for human rights abuse. But in those days, that was the normal. And it was, we started to go into lodges, and then, the business kind of, we grew into, 2 of our guides wanted to be in Malawi, and we moved off to Malawi. And then in 94, when South Africa became a democracy, we opened up a couple of lodges in South Africa. And then the business, we had sort of a whole lot of, a lot of businesses, they go flat and then they suddenly you get a boost and you go up.
Yeah.
We had a couple of those really nice little boosts along the way. And yeah, eventually we ran in 7 countries, something like over 50 lodges and something like 3,000 people. It's sort of the most remarkable thing. But this is, because we started with nothing. Chris and I were running mobiles in the 70s, and we had saved up an equivalent of about $1,000 each. And we started Wilderness with that. So we were very, very fortunate because we didn't have the cash to go and buy. We started to do partnerships with local communities. And there was no kind of rule book in those days. There was no kind of guidelines. You couldn't call on anybody because it had never been done before. So we'd sit down with communities in the middle of nowhere and sit down and really talk to them and say, listen, I need to use your land if you agree. And in return, we'll pay you and we'll employ your people. And it was kind of like this feeling your way in the dark. And we kind of got to a recipe which, by trial and error, just kind of worked. It really worked. And this is just through being fair. By there's only so many sweeties. And okay, how do we share up the sweeties in such a way that you happy and we happy? And so we started to dabble with those type of arrangements. And it was remarkable. We ended up just being able to create some of the most magnificent partnerships with local communities and to create these conservancies.
Yeah.
And many of them, in fact, all of them are still going on today. I think something like 35% of Namibia is now set aside for community conservancies along the exact same lines of what we pioneered in those early days by accident.
Yeah.
And one of the very first meetings we ever had with the community chief was in Namibia in November. It was well over 40 degrees, and we met underneath this tiny tree. And we kind of just, from the community side and the chief and our side, we kind of just muddled our way through. And just by everybody being fair, we arrived at a recipe which worked. It was just one of those extraordinary things. And then what we quickly learned is that what is good for one community is not going to be good for another, not going to be good for another. Everybody's got their own particular requirements and everybody's got their own needs. And so while we thought, hey, we've got the perfect blueprint here, oh my goodness, it couldn't work here. It certainly wouldn't work there. So we had to also, with the basic framework of being fair and sharing, then cater every deal according to the community's needs and their own particular environments.
Yeah.
Something in Namibia, which is massive and arid, you need big chunks of land. And in the Okavango, it was a totally different story. Initially, we did deals with some of the hunting companies, and we shared concessions, and we were paying a fortune to be in those areas. But to share with the hunter is just impossible. I mean, some of the most embarrassing times we had was, we'd have, and these concessions in Botswana were big, these hunting concessions, and you split it down the middle, and there's enough land on that side for the hunting, and enough land for us here in theory, until you're actually operating with them. And we had one of the most embarrassing times of our life.
What happened?
Must have been about the 1990s, and we were using Land Rovers in those days, and so we came out of the camp at about 3 or something like that, 3:30, and there was a huge herd of buffalo, literally within 5 minutes of the camp. And so we had 2 vehicles, and we pulled out there, and we're just watching this peaceful bunch of buffalo going and doing their stuff. And they're chomping, and they're doing this, and they're... And then we heard a different engine, and we said, hey, that's not a Land Rover. It's a Land Cruiser. What's a Land Cruiser doing in our area? Anyway, this Land Cruiser pulls up with a hunting guy, and a big, big, fat guy literally got out the passenger vehicle. He could hardly walk, and they paced out 75 meters because you couldn't shoot from a vehicle. You had to pace yourself. So they paced out 75 meters away from the vehicle in front of us. And they put down hunting sticks, and this hunter lined up the rifle, and in front of our guests,
oh my God,
went and shot one of the buffalo in front of us. Oh my goodness.
My God.
We were quoted in newspapers overseas, all the rest of it. And we realized, hang on, this cohabitation doesn't work. So then we started to tender for these areas ourselves. And we knew that photographics employed a hell of a lot more. It's a 12 months of the year industry versus a 6. We knew that we could generate a hell of a lot more money for local communities through non-hunting, through photographics. And so we started to tender for these hunting areas, and we won almost every one of them. If you look at the map of Botswana today, and I mean, the Okavango Delta was probably 80-90% hunting in those days, besides the little sliver of Maremi.
Yeah.
And now it's all the Okavango Delta and around the Nyanti and all that is all photographics. It's all started from that because we knew that the benefits from photographics would be far, far better. And that's why I say today, Botswana is much, much better than it was even in the 70s. And everybody looks at how generally the planet's gone down, how we kind of got to the stage that human beings, all 8 billion of us, are consuming 1.5 times the planet. It wasn't in those days. We've seen in most areas how the wildlife has gone down, the populations have crashed. I mean, when I was born, there were, 450,000 lions, and we've got 23,000 lions today. A 95% drop-off in my life. I mean, that's such a horrible statistic. But it's the same with leopards and all the rest of it. But the one area which has defied the drop-off is Botswana. It's actually better today than it was in the 70s. It's quite remarkable how that swing around. But we've gone from a primary hunting industry to now a primary photographic industry. And that's been part of the shift.
We'll be back with more Safari Changemakers after this.
Safari Changemakers is brought to you by Artisans of Safari. Beyond the map lies adventure. With nearly 40 years guiding travelers into Africa's hidden sanctuaries, we craft journeys as individual as your fingerprint. Expertly designed, deeply personal. Connect with Karin at artisansofsafari.com for your collaborative consultation. Your safari, your story. Artisans of Safari.
What were those landowners using the land for before they met with you to turn them into conservancies?
Well, it's extraordinary, and I kind of shudder. That one Namibian family, what is the Torah Conservancy, the chief and his entire clan, not one person had ever had a formal job. So they were literally subsistence living out in the middle of nowhere, not even farmers, I mean goats.
Okay.
And really, I mean, living in some of the harshest conditions, trying to eke out an existence.
Yeah.
I mean, it was incredibly, incredibly harsh countryside. And you go today, that group, they've got a foundation which has got cash in the bank, and they've got veggie gardens and all the rest of it. So we've seen this extraordinary transition from literally not quite hunter-gatherer, but a kind of a subsistence livestock farmer, living out in the desert, to being a partner with photo tourism and making an extraordinary amount of cash out of that. I mean, our deal then for that particular camp was to pay 10% of revenue, a base rental, and 10% of gross revenue across to the community. And that's what the most successful projects in Africa are, depending on the cash value of the standard of the lodge, but anything from 6% of your revenue to about 10% is about the sweet spot of gross revenue. So, a lot of people say, well, why are safaris in Africa so expensive? Well, first of all, they're all inclusive. You get all your booze, all your activities. We had this discussion just the other day. It was, why is a safari camp in Africa so much more expensive than a hotel in Paris? Well, hang on. In Paris, you get a bed, you might be lucky to get a snack for breakfast. But here, everything was included. And when you start to take off all the different costs, we've got to pay VAT at 15%, but then you've got to take off 10% for the community, all these type of costs. And then you have a training levy. Then, because there's no hospitality in these countries, we've got to have our own basic hospitality training places. So we train up people who've come out of the middle of nowhere and who've never had running water, never had electricity. And now they've got to operate to first world standards. Well, it costs money. You've got to take them and train them and train them and train them. Fortunately, we're so blessed in Africa with this extraordinary warmth of local people that it kind of oversees a lot of the finesse that you'd expect in the top Paris and the Savoy or the Ritz from the local waiters there. It's that spirit of humanity and that fun and that kind of glint in the eye, which kind of covers up a lot of the lack of formal training and hospitality. But that's that warmth which comes through. But it's all a cost. So once you take it off all these things, there's not much left for the, to go and start paying your salaries and wages and all those type of things. We take it for granted. When a guest comes into the lodge and they want sunny side up or easy over or 4 minutes or medium soft poached, for a person who's come out of the middle of nowhere, who's never seen an egg, any egg, anyway, chopped up, scrambled, chucked on the floor is amazing.
Yeah.
Now, how do you explain to somebody like that actually it's going to be easy over and it's going to be this and that? It's all part of the trick of making this thing work, and there's costs.
Yeah, I remember ordering a martini in Tanzania on my honeymoon in 1995, and they just took a bottle of martini and Rossi and poured it in a glass.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
But things have changed, and that training of people to serve is quite remarkable.
You think about that. If you take, like, we're at Natural Selection now, we employ 1,200 people. 99% of those people come from rural areas in the middle of nowhere. 99%. And it's because you're employing from around you. And that's the key. Because if the local folk aren't getting the benefits of tourism, if they're not getting the jobs, they're not getting the cash, we've got no chance.
Yeah.
And coming back to that stat about, 95% drop off in the lion population. I mean, it's an extraordinary stat. But our one chance of getting this thing right is that we have to even further embrace local communities at every single level. And it's not just the job now. It's going much, much deeper. How do we actually get the broad-based community, the grandmother over there, and this little 2-year-old toddler down here? How do you get them all to feel the positive effects of tourism? And that's really the challenge now. And I think some people are doing it amazingly well. There are some pirates in our industry which don't give a hoot. Fortunately, that's becoming a minority. It's not the case not so long ago. I mean, at one stage, tourism was the second most extractive industry in Africa. That was a shocking stat. But mining was number one extractive, number two was tourism. Fortunately, the whole sector, the whole tourism sector, almost throughout Africa, has had a massive swing around. We've got a lot of passionate people involved who really want to do the right thing. And we've seen this advancing of technology. Solar is now cheaper. We don't have to run generators. I mean, we were all guilty as an industry running generators in our lodges. But you run a generator for an hour and you chuck out half a ton of carbon. Can't do it. We can't maintain it. It's not sustainable. So we're lucky that we're getting a whole new bunch of people in the industry who really do care for the environment and care for people, who are determined to make a difference. And we've had technology. So the grey water and black water in the camps, the sewage systems and all that are now really, really top of the class. And we've got the solar system, which is so effective. There's no need to run generators these days. So, all those kind of things have helped make tourism become a positive contributor to change, as opposed to 20, 30 years ago when tourism was an extractive industry.
Join us for part 2 of our discussion with Colin Bell in our next edition of Safari Changemakers. Be sure to hit subscribe on YouTube or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Till next time, I'm Karin Jones.